what I want to talk about is the role of housing markets in the run-up to the crisis, and I want to exactly pick up where Chris left off to show you a set of results about housing market and mortgage markets in the run-up and the aftermath of the crisis that might actually, to some of you, be surprising given the narratives that we, in a way have learned to believe about housing markets in the Great Recession. And all this work is joint work with Manuela Delino and Felipe Savarino, who are my co-authors in a set of papers and also in an RFE paper that we wrote for this volume. So, kind of what I want to pick up on is something that Chris said at the end, which is that the narrative about the crisis initially started off focusing on only focusing on distorted incentives in housing markets that then led to a bunch of trigger-on effects. But what I want to show you today is a set of results, empirical results, that much more suggests that what we had at the core of the housing market was a classic housing bubble that then led basically, or driven by rising house prices and over-optimistic beliefs, we saw that households increased borrowing, and households also increased just participation and buying in housing markets. But at the same time, banks also bought into these rising housing prices and expectations by lending against collateral, if you want, unabashedly. And in some sense seem to have underestimated the potential for reversal in house prices and basically with it the defaults that then Chris was talking about. And before I show you the results, to me the big takeaway or the big, in a way, misnomer of this crisis is that we're still calling it the subprime crisis, when what I will show you is actually this was a much wider crisis in the housing market, and in particular middle class and upper middle class borrowers were very much part of the credit expansion and in particular the defaults afterwards. And this obviously matters, as we'll discuss at the end, because it affects how we want to think about policy implications and preventing these kind of crises going forward. So, in a way, the way I see this is that the financial sector acted as an amplification mechanism by lending into these increased house prices, which kind of picked up on the over-optimistic expectations. But what we do not find, and I show you now the data, is that there was somehow a unilateral shift or an unprecedented shift, say, of lending to just marginal or subprime borrowers. Again, right, there was an overarching shift. So the facts, kind of that we'll be looking at today is basically first focusing on the run-up to the financial crisis. What I'll show you is that credit expanded across the income distribution. It didn't just expand, say, for subprime or poor and marginal borrowers. In particular, I'll show you that middle and high-income households actually had much larger contributions to the run-up in the total dollar of mortgage debt before the crisis. And then I'll also show you that actually, those households afterwards defaulted at a very high level. But interestingly, what we'll also show you is that debt to income levels expanded proportionally across all types of borrowers: subprime and prime borrowers, low income, high income borrowers. Surprisingly, at the same time, we see that the loan-to-value distribution, the LTV distribution, actually stayed stable over that time period, meaning that we, in particular, the increase in the debt-to-income levels seem to have been fueled by lending against increased collateral values, but not a shift towards higher LTVs. And I'll show you this in a second. Now, on top of it, I'll also show you that there are that homeowners seem to have been buying and selling or flipping housing at a much higher rate in the run-up to the crisis. But surprisingly, we do not find, for example, that ownership rate increased. In fact, if anything, home ownership rates decreased even prior to the crisis, which is actually a result that it's quite surprising. But as I'll show you, it's heterogeneous between subprime and prime, or poorer and richer borrowers. And then, in the aftermath of the crisis, I will show you how there were sharp increases in delinquency rates, but the biggest increase in the dollar value of defaults actually came from the middle class and the upper middle class, who defaulted at an unprecedented rate. All right, so let's dive into the data. Ultimately, right, this is, as Chris also said, an empirical question. So the first thing, as I said, right, what I want to show you is in the run-up to the financial crisis, there was no dislocation of where credit was flowing, but what we see is that there was a symmetric increase, if you want, of homeowners participating in the housing market and in the mortgage market over that time period. So the first thing I'll show you, if you look from the left to the right, this is mortgage dollars originated by income quantile, right? The top is the highest income quantile, the bottom is the lowest income quantile, which we fixed as of 2000, right, and then held constant. And this is to show you that actually from 2002 till 2006, year by year, the distribution of mortgage dollars actually stayed constant, right? So if you look at this, right, the white white cells at the bottom, this would be typically probably your low-income subprime customers, but you see that there was not a disproportionate increase of credit flowing to these groups. No, instead we see that across the income distribution, people were participating and, of course, expanding borrowing over this time period. I can show you this also in a different, oops, why is it doing it? Okay, I can show you this in a different way. Rather than binning by income, I bin by FICO score. So this is what we typically would call subprime, right below 660, between 660 and 620, and the top graph here, and 720, and the top graph is above 720. And what you see again is that between 2000 and 2006, we actually see that the fraction of mortgage dollars flowing to subprime customers stayed constant, right? Of course, the mortgage market expanded. There was much more lending done, but the distribution across the different FICO bins actually stayed constant, right? So again, this is saying that there was not a disproportionate shift of where mortgage dollars were originated or where they were flowing. Another way of saying, again, right, is that everybody seemed to have been participating in that credit boom. All right, so of course, I already said, right, these graphs, while I'm saying they proportionately stay flat, we know that underneath it, total amount of dollar raised, right, or originated, increased. And how can I see this? There's two ways I can show you that. Number one is, so this is from the Survey of Consumer Finance. This is total mortgage dollar at the household level, including, people call it CLTV, right, including second liens and all mortgage dollars. So what you see is proportionately across all income quintiles, debt to income level at the household level increased, right? But it was, again, proportionate across all income levels. There was not a, disproportionate shift to, say, more marginal or subprime borrowers. Or another way of saying this, right, it seems everybody bought into this housing bubble and basically into the increased housing prices. Actually, surprisingly, just to show you, in a way, almost how mechanical people were borrowing is when you look at the loan-to-value distribution, right, the famous LTV, from the mid-1990s, and I'll show you this basically till 2012, what you see is that distribution actually stayed very flat, right? So this is saying that the fraction of households that had, say, a 95% LTV, a 90% LTV, right, an 80% LTV, these are, the bins here, right, again, stayed stable over that time period. Now, of course, I showed you that DTI went up. So what does this mean? What this means is that because the value of homes were going up, right, people were able to take on more credit against those now more valuable houses, therefore DTI went up, but the loan-to-value distribution, right, stayed stable, meaning that what banks did is they just almost, you could say, mechanically lent against these now higher house price values, right? Now, why I'm making such a big deal out of it, it's because that actually suggests that in some sense what went wrong here is really the expectations about how believable and how stable these house values are, and how banks should have treated them as collateral. And what this data shows you is that they basically believed what they saw and did not become, say, more cautious after seeing a huge run-up of prices in many areas. All right, the final thing I want to show you, because in the run-up part, is lots of people then have said, okay, maybe the intensity, right, meaning the fraction of loans that people took on is, as you said, right, and is kind of this story. But what about the extensive margin, right? I'm sure many of you have heard this story that, oh, but what the banks really got wrong is they started to lend to more and more marginal borrowers. They kind of were digging in the garbage can, right, as people sometimes like to say, and get out basically loans that should have never been made. Actually, if you thought about if that was true, right, we should have actually seen an expansion of home ownership within the US over that pre-crisis period. But what this graph shows you is that this is exactly not the case. In fact, it's quite stunning. So what we do here is we plot for you changes in home ownership rates against, again, by these by these income bins that I showed you before, right? And blue here is the lowest income bin, red is the second to lowest, and then so on and so on. And what you see, and we normalize in 2000 by basically the rate of home ownership for each bin in 2000. Now, what do you see? What you see actually is that the fraction of home ownership in the lowest two income bins started going down already, in 2002, 2003, and then really accelerated, of course, after 2007, 2008, right? So this is to show you that actually it looks much more like many low-income households started being priced out of the housing market way before 2007, right? So it was not the case that the run-up to the financial crisis or the boom period of the 2000s afforded low-income and subprime people to enter home ownership at an unprecedented rate. If anything, right, these numbers show you that, yes, for richer people, there was an increase in home ownership, right? These are the top three graphs. But for poorer people, actually, it started already declining way before 2007. And then, as obviously this graph shows, very much accelerated post-2008. Great. So, I mentioned this. I want to skip over this quickly, right? What we also saw, and there's a large literature that is now, kind of coming back to this, is that the flipping or the speed at which houses were bought and sold leading up to 2008 increased dramatically. And so what this is showing you is kind of data from Zillow, the fraction of homes that were bought and sold within 12 months of a given year, right? And what you see is kind of leading, up from 1998, you see this big spike in the speed of churning, and then, of course, post-2008, right, the big drop-off. But this, again, right, is suggesting that households across the income distribution were participating in the housing market and with it in the mortgage market at a very high rate. All right, excellent. So this is, kind of the run-up. And in a way, I wanted to show you these results because they suggest that there was a widespread participation across income groups, across FICO scores, subprime and prime borrowers, and that in particular, right, it looks like even at the extensive margin in the run-up to the crisis, we didn't see an increase in participation, but we saw of say marginal homeowners, we saw a doubling up, or kind of a more intensive participation of the middle class and the upper middle class. Now, a final piece of information I want to show you from the aftermath of the financial crisis is who defaulted. So Chris already showed you in, in a really nice presentation, right? The type of trade-offs that people make when they consider life events and whether they're underwater or not, right, in the default decisions. I want to just show you one very simple thing that actually, Chris and Paul, for example, have also shown in their work, but didn't maybe come out as much, kind of in what he showed you, which is that house price movements mattered a lot in who defaulted. So the first thing I want to show you is just, cross-sectionally, who starts defaulting post-2008? The first bar I'm showing you here, very similar to what I showed you about, kind of origination dollars, is we take every cohort, say, the most leftward here is 2003. So mortgages originated in 2003, sorted by whether they are subprime, meaning below 660, between 660, 720, and above 720, right? And then we follow them for 3 years and see what fraction defaults within the first 3 years. And we take 3 years because very often, right, the modal time period by which people who will default start defaulting is often 3 years. That's why we follow 3 years, but we can do the same for 5 years, 6 years. It would look exactly the same thing, right? But what the first bar here shows you is what you would normally have expected, right? Which is that most of the dollars mortgage dollars in default after 3 years come from the subprime group, right? Come from the white part of this bar. 70% of dollars in default are people with a FICO score below 660, and only 9% are people with a FICO score above 720. 720, which is exactly what should be the case when we have a functioning mortgage market, right? The people that are of good credit score default at a much lower rate than the people that kind of are low FICO score. But now fast forward, right, 3 years, and what do you see? So this is mortgages originated in 2006, which I now follow right till 2009. And what you see is that a big shift is happening. The mortgage dollars in default, right, increase the most in the medium and the prime segment, meaning in the group that is 660 to 720 and above 720, right? And you see that the white bars, so the below 660, are going down significantly, right, over that time period. So what's going on there, right? What's going on is actually that the default rates of the middle class and the upper middle class went up, and they went to unprecedented rates in the US, but the rate itself, right, the increase was significant, but the rate, of course, is not as high as subprime. Let me say this in a different way. So if you look at 2003, you would have had, even in normal times in the housing market, the subprime group might default at a rate of 6 or 7%, even when there was no housing crisis, right? That's why they have low FICO scores. But high FICO borrowers, in normal times, default basically at a zero likelihood. But what happened post-2008 is that the high FICO borrowers are the ones that start defaulting after 2008. And as Chris was saying, right, it's a combination of being underwater and potentially having life events. But the important thing to note is that the high income and high FICO borrowers are the ones that have the big mortgages. So when they went from 0% default to 4 or 5%, that's when the market really got into trouble, right? And that's when we see these big increases of dollar in default of the high prime and medium prime customers, right? And that's the big shift that we hadn't seen before in that housing market. And then as a last thing, right, what we can do is cut or divide the sample by people who live in neighborhoods that saw a rapid increase in house prices and then a crash, versus those where there was not much of a difference. So on the left are the people that live in neighborhoods or zip codes where there was not as much as a price run up. And on the right are the part of the US where there was a big increase in prices and then a drop. And look, what you see is that the big increase in prime borrowers defaulting is exactly in the areas where prices went up and then crashed, right? Again, saying that house price movements not only played a huge role in who took on mortgage leverage and participation in the mortgage market, but also then who defaulted afterwards, right? So all this is to show you that house prices and house price expectations seem to have played a very important role in the run-up to the crisis, and then explaining also default behavior of mortgage participation or borrowers in the crisis. And why this is so important is that this actually suggests that the way we want to think about regulation in mortgage market is very much from a macroprudential perspective, right? This is not, these type of expectation shifts is not something we can regulate at a bank-by-bank basis or at a microprudential level, but we really have to think about this from a systemic perspective, as many of the speakers just in the panel before have also basically alluded to. Thank you very much.